Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take complex research and, really big philosophical puzzles and try to break them down into the essential knowledge you need to navigate a complicated world.
It's great to be back.
Today, we are taking a massive intellectual magnifying glass to the very foundations of knowledge itself, epistemology, but we're going to be broadening the scope way beyond just the individual mind.
That's right. We're tackling what happens when we start to talk about knowledge that's held by a group or maybe an organization or even, a highly advanced AI.
And this whole deep dive, it's really driven by something that's surprisingly common, something we all do.
It's a linguistic habit, but one with huge philosophical implications. We're constantly ascribing what are called epistemic states, so states like knowledge or justified belief or rationality, not just to individual people, but to these powerful social entities.
And we really do it without even thinking twice about it. We say things like, NATO knows the strategy for the region, or
the jury justifiably believes the defendant is guilty. That's a huge one in law.
Right. Or maybe something like, the World Health Organization is convinced the vaccine rollout is effective. We say it, and we feel like it means something.
Exactly. And these don't feel like just, colorful metaphors. They seem to be powerful statements that carry real-world weight. They have predictive power.
But this is where the massive philosophical puzzle that we're trying to unlock today comes in.
Yes.
If a single human mind and a massive, completely decentralized organization like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, if they can both legitimately know that climate change is anthropogenic, are we actually using the exact same concept of knowledge in both cases?
That's the million-dollar question. Are we defining justification the same way when we talk about a single scientist versus an entire Senate committee?
It feels like we can't be.
And maybe even more fundamentally, should we be using the same methodology to analyze and define these concepts across all these wildly different types of agents? It's not just a question about words. It's a meta-epistemological challenge. It's a question about how we even do philosophy.
Because, traditionally, philosophy has focused on the individual mind, which makes sense. We are individuals.
Of course, that's our primary mode of experience. But the minute the focus shifts to a group, the rules, well, they seem to change, or at the very least, they fracture.
And this fracturing is the core issue we're digging into.
Right. Because while a lot of philosophers working in what's called social or collective epistemology, while they make implicit methodological assumptions, either borrowing concepts from individual philosophy or creating totally new ones just for groups, there has been surprisingly little explicit engagement with that core question.
The question of whether we should unify our methodology for studying knowledge across all agents.
Nobody's really stepped back to ask, wait, should we have one rule book here?
So that brings us to our mission for today, unpacking something called generic epistemology, or GE for short.
Generic epistemology is, at its heart, a proposal for a unified approach. It essentially says we should treat individual epistemology, collective epistemology, and potentially the study of any other cognitive agent.
You mean like non-human animals?
Exactly. Non-human animals, or maybe highly sophisticated synthetic agents in the future. It says we should treat all of these as continuous domains of inquiry. The ambition is huge. It's to analyze what philosophers call knowledge simpliciter.
Knowledge simpliciter, just knowledge itself.
Yes. Treating knowledge as a fundamental phenomenon regardless of the kind of entity that happens to possess it.
So GE is basically an invitation to intellectual consistency. Instead of having like a separate philosophy department for human knowledge and another for collective knowledge and a third for AI knowledge, we'd build one big conceptual umbrella.
Precisely. And the way GE proposes to do this is really interesting. It's by extending and generalizing the most successful tool that philosophers currently use for conceptual analysis.
And what's that?
The method of cases. We're going to break that down in a lot more detail later, but first, we need to just make sure our foundational terminology is broad enough to even support this massive conceptual reach.
Right, okay. Let's define the terminological landscape for this unified domain.
We need placeholders, really. So for this discussion, we'll use the term epistemic agent as a generalized placeholder. It means any entity that can genuinely bear a cognitive state. It's intentionally a very inclusive term.
So a person, a jury, a corporation, an AI, they're all potentially epistemic agents.
Potentially, yes. And then we have cognitive state. That's our placeholder for all the phenomena we're evaluating. All the doxastic attitudes like credences, beliefs, but also the normative properties like knowledge itself, justification, rationality, and so on.
Okay, this framework already feels pretty radical because it's demanding that we view a highly structured corporate entity, a solitary human mind, and maybe even like a swarm of insects functioning as a unit, that they could all potentially reside in the same domain of study.
It immediately forces us to challenge our own, our anthropocentric biases.
Our human-centered way of looking at things.
It does. It forces us to ask, what properties are truly necessary for knowledge and which ones are just? Well, artifacts of the specific agent we happen to be studying most of the time, which is ourselves.
Right, so let's anchor ourselves a bit by establishing that historical baseline. Traditional epistemology, for centuries, it had this laser-like focus on the individual agent.
It really did. The questions were almost always internal. How do I form a rational belief? Is my conviction justified? It was all about the individual's doxastic attitudes and their normative evaluation.
And that's the starting point that everyone agrees on.
That's the uncontroversial starting point, yes. But then came the recognition that human knowledge is almost never formed in a vacuum. And that led to the rise of what we broadly call social epistemology.
But you're saying that term social epistemology is actually pretty ambiguous.
Notoriously so. And clarifying its meaning is absolutely paramount if we're going to set up the contrast with generic epistemology. You have to know what you're arguing against.
Okay, so how many distinct meanings of social do we need to worry about here?
We need to distinguish between at least two major camps, and they have fundamentally different targets. First, there's what we can call preservationist social epistemology.
Preservationist. So it's trying to preserve the focus on the individual.
You've got it. This school of thought situates the individual knower within a social environment. It investigates how individuals ought to manage challenges that arise from their social context.
So things like testimony or peer disagreement.
Exactly. How should I treat the testimony of a stranger? When should I defer to an expert's opinion? How should I revise my own belief when I'm faced with a peer, someone just as smart as me, who completely disagrees?
Okay, so if say I'm preparing for a medical procedure, and I go and consult 5 different doctors who all give me slightly different advice.
Right.
The preservationist is interested in the epistemically rational decision-making process that I use to weigh those expert opinions. The knower, the agent, is still me, the individual.
Precisely. It preserved the methodological focus on the individual, even while it's acknowledging the crucial influence of all that social imprint. It's trying to develop rational norms for how individuals should interact.
Okay, that feels comfortable. That feels familiar. So what's the other flavor of social epistemology? The one that contrasts directly with this individual focus?
That would be expansionist social epistemology, but it's most often just called collective epistemology. And this is where the big conceptual leap happens.
How so?
It doesn't ask how individuals react to society. It asks if groups themselves, the collective entity, can be genuine bearers of cognitive states. Can the group, as a corporate agent, be rational or justified, or can it truly possess knowledge?
Whoa. Okay, so that is a radical shift. We're no longer just talking about summing up individual beliefs.
Not at all.
We're talking about emergent properties, things that belong to the collective structure itself.
Absolutely. Think about a complex research collaboration or a legal body like a court. When we say the European Space Agency knows how to execute a mission to Mars, we don't just mean that one single engineer has all of that knowledge in their head.
Of course not. That would be impossible.
We mean the structured entity, the whole organization, operating with all its specialized subgroups and defined rules and communication channels, that it possesses the knowledge. Collective epistemology takes concepts like knowledge and justification from the individual realm, and it tries to extrapolate or translate them to these social entities.
And this expansionist trend, this is what brought that core methodological question right back to the fore.
Exactly. Because if you have individual epistemology studying single agents, and then you have collective epistemology studying corporate agents, the philosophical community, well, it hasn't reached any consensus on what the deeper relationship between them is.
We're just sort of left with this massive conceptual void.
A huge void. Do the concepts, knowledge, justification, do they have to be conceptually the same across both of those domains? And must the methods we use to analyze them be applied uniformly?
And different schools of thought have given different implicit answers to that.
They have. Some treat them as totally separate fields. Some treat one as primary and the other as secondary. But very few have tackled that meta-question head-on.
And this is exactly why generic epistemology becomes necessary.
Yes. It's a meta-framework. It's designed specifically to step back and adjudicate that relationship, treating them not just as, potentially similar, but as continuous and equal domains of inquiry from the get-go.
It demands a single, unified method.
That's the goal.
Okay, so before we can really appreciate how radical a step generic epistemology is, we need to understand the mechanics of conceptual analysis itself. You mentioned the method of cases. Let's dive into that, because this is the tool GE plans to generalize.
Absolutely. To understand the method of cases, we first need to look at this great meta-epistemological split, which was traditionally detailed by the philosopher Roderick Chisholm. It's the choice between two strategies: methodism and particularism.
Okay, can you give us a simple analogy for methodism?
Sure. Imagine you're writing a cookbook. Methodism says, I must first write down the perfect universal cooking rules. The method. For example, a rule might be, always bake at 350 degrees for exactly 30 minutes, or it isn't a successful dish.
A very strict rule.
A very strict rule. Once I have that method, I apply it to all my specific cooking cases. So if I try to bake a delicate souffle and it collapses, the methodist says, well, you didn't follow the 30-minute rule, therefore it is not a successful dish. The general rule dictates the judgment of the specific case.
That sounds a lot like classical rationalism or empiricism, where you start with these huge foundational principles like all knowledge must come from sensory experience, or all knowledge must be deductively sound, and then you evaluate every specific example based on whether it adheres to your rulebook.
Exactly. But you can see how this runs into severe problems, especially when the method itself is what's being challenged. If you use your method to define what counts as knowledge, you might just accidentally rule out a ton of things we instinctively feel we know.
And that's where the alternative comes in. So we turn to particularism.
Yes, and this flips the entire process on its head.
How so?
Particularism starts with the uncontroversial case judgments. If methodism asks, how do we know? Particularism asks, what do we know?
Okay, so back to the cooking analogy.
In our cooking analogy, the particularist bakes a souffle, it comes out perfectly, and they say, this souffle is perfect, it's successful. And then only after accumulating many, many successful cases, this cake worked, this bread worked, this roast worked, they try to deduce a general rule.
So they might conclude, a successful souffle method must actually allow for variation in temperature and timing based on things like altitude and the quality of the ingredients.
Precisely. The judgment of the case comes first, and the general rule is derived from it.
In philosophy, the classic particularist approach, it really centers on defining knowledge. For centuries, the big case judgment was that knowledge required justified true belief. JTB.
Right, that was the standard definition. Yeah. But then came this huge moment in 1963.
The Gettier cases.
The legendary Gettier cases, yes. The philosopher Edmund Gettier introduced these really clever hypothetical scenarios. In them, a subject had a justified true belief, but intuitively, and this word intuitively is the key, they did not seem to have knowledge.
So these cases worked as counterexamples. They leveraged our strong, shared, uncontroversial gut feeling about a specific case to challenge the general definition.
That's the power of particularism. It grounds philosophy in our shared human intuition, doesn't it? It has this underlying assumption that we can, in principle, reliably distinguish between instances of knowledge and justified belief and instances where they're lacking.
And that assumption, it sort of implicitly rules out radical skepticism or eliminativism right from the very beginning.
That's a crucial insight. It presupposes that success is achievable and, more importantly, that it's recognizable. And this procedural structure, starting with judgments and deriving theories from them, it's applied universally across all the different branches of epistemology.
Including the collective domain.
Absolutely.
So collective epistemologists also start with judgments like the New York Times, as a corporate entity, made a justified editorial decision. And then they use that specific case to help build a general theory of group justification.
Precisely. They use those intuitive case judgments to draft a theory, and then they test that theory against more complex counterexamples. Say, a collective that reaches a seemingly justified conclusion, but it does so through a deeply flawed, maybe non-representative internal process.
And they adjust and refine until some kind of stability is reached.
It's a constant process of refinement.
But if they're constantly adjusting, it can't just be our gut intuition leading the charge. How does the theory itself start to gain some influence over the cases?
That's the crucial next step. That's where particularism gets integrated with the method of reflective equilibrium.
Okay, a new term.
It was developed by the philosopher Nelson Goodman, and it describes this dynamic back-and-forth process. Our case judgments and the general methods or principles we derive from them are brought into balance by mutual adjustment.
Can you give us a really clear analogy for that, something outside of philosophy?
I think constitutional law and legal precedent is a great one. We have fundamental constitutional principles, right? That's like the general method or theory. We also have specific landmark court cases. Those are our case judgments. Sometimes a new weird court case comes along that forces us to reinterpret the Constitution in a new way, effectively revising the general rule. Conversely, sometimes a very strong, very established constitutional principle forces us to look back at an older case and realize that our initial local judgment about that case was probably flawed.
So we revise the case judgment.
And they constantly negotiate. It's a two-way street.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So no single case judgment is completely untouchable, and no general theory is totally immune to counterexamples.
The key takeaway here is that this process implies that no methodology truly starts from a clean slate. Even our most basic initial case judgments are implicitly relying on some kind of underlying framework for how we categorize or value things.
So the method of cases, this combination of particularism and reflective equilibrium, that's the foundation.
It is the foundation, and now the generic epistemologist comes along and says, let's apply this incredibly successful foundation to everything.
Okay, so this is the big move. The conceptual leap of generic epistemology, GE, is simply the decision to apply that method of cases to a massively extended domain.
An extended domain that includes all potential epistemic agents. So individuals, collectives, non-human animals, advanced AI, any entity we might encounter in the future.
That immediately sounds incredibly daunting. We're taking a process that's been finely tuned over decades to work with human intuition, and suddenly we're demanding it work for, I don't know, a robot operating system or an ancient bureaucracy.
It is daunting, and that is exactly why GE requires two fundamental principles to guide this massive extension. These are principles that generalize the kind of implicit consistency that's already required by the method of cases.
All right, let's unpack the first principle then, conceptual unity.
This is general unity. And its core idea is that epistemic concepts, so knowledge, justification, rationality, they have to pick out genuine, non-disjunctive kinds. In other words, we assume we are studying knowledge simpliciter.
Okay, so if the IPCC knows P, and I, a solitary individual, also know P, then the property of being knowledge should be the same underlying phenomenon in both cases.
Yes, unless the theoretical costs of trying to unify them become just astronomically high.
So this principle is really a commitment against conceptual proliferation. It stops us from just inventing new types of knowledge whenever we hit a difficult case.
Exactly. It prevents the easy fracturing of concepts. It tells us that if we define a concept like justification based on, say, internal individual experiences, and then we go to look at a collective entity that cannot have internal experiences, we shouldn't just immediately assume the group has a completely different kind of justification.
We should assume the group's justification must meet the same fundamental criteria as the individual's, whatever those criteria turn out to be.
We have to try to find that common ground.
Wow, that is a radical starting point, because it immediately challenges any theory that is domain-specific. If a theory of knowledge relies entirely on phenomenal consciousness, something only individuals possess, unity tells us that theory is fundamentally incomplete, or maybe even just wrong, about knowledge simpliciter.
That's the power of the constraint. And this commitment to unity, it leads directly into the second principle, which is methodological non-primacy.
General non-primacy.
Yes.
What does methodological non-primacy demand of us?
It demands that our case judgments be kind-blind. The way we weigh, select, and factor those judgments cannot be sensitive to the idiosyncratic or unique properties of the agent involved.
So epistemology has no methodologically preferred starting point.
None.
Okay, let me try to voice the skepticism I'm sure some listeners are feeling right now. If I ask a philosopher to rate their certainty about two statements, A, I know I am currently speaking, and B, the United States government knows the interest rate trend, most of them will intuitively say that A is a much stronger, clearer case of knowledge. Is that a violation of non-primacy?
That's a great question, and the answer is not necessarily. Non-primacy doesn't say all judgments have to have equal weight. It says the reasons for weighting them differently must be strictly epistemic, not based on the type of agent.
What's an epistemic reason?
Well, if case A is considered stronger because it relies on a more central, less contested form of evidence like direct experience, that's an epistemic reason. But if you dismiss case B simply because it involves a collective, if your reasoning is, oh, collectives can't truly know anything, so this case is irrelevant, then you have violated non-primacy.
Because you've asserted methodological primacy for the individual. You've given it a special protected status.
You've rigged the game from the start.
Okay, so the demand for fairness. The genericist has to accept that an intuitive judgment about a collective agent could, in principle, be just as central and powerful a constraint on the theory of knowledge as a judgment about an individual agent.
Precisely. It's a kind of intellectual democracy. And taking this generic stance isn't just about adopting these two principles. It's about taking on a whole epistemic stance. It's an orientation that's committed to challenging what you might call methodological species chauvinism.
Rejecting the notion that human individuals are the default or the superior or the primary objects of analysis just because they're us.
That really is the most radical element. It forces us to redefine what is epistemologically relevant. If a theory of knowledge requires features unique to the human mind, like phenomenal qualia, non-primacy forces us to justify why those features are essential for knowledge in general, and not just for humans.
That's a huge burden of proof.
It is. It makes us look for the necessary functional structure, not the accidental biological hardware that it happens to run on.
Now, if we accept this stance, we still have to acknowledge that some concepts will be agent-specific, right? I mean, a group of people communicating can have common knowledge, which is a concept that just doesn't make sense for a single person. How does GE reconcile these necessary differences?
This is handled by making a distinction between global concepts and local concepts within the GE framework.
Okay.
The global concepts are the primary target. Things like knowledge itself, justification, truth tracking. They must be domain independent and hold true across all agent types.
And local concepts.
Local concepts are domain specific. They describe emergent phenomena that are tied to the specific type of agent you're looking at. So your example, common knowledge that is shared and known to be shared by all members of a collective is an absolutely essential local concept for understanding collective action and rationality, but it only makes sense in a structured group.
Sure.
Similarly, you might argue that certain forms of internal conscious introspection are local concepts that are tied to the individual human mind.
So the genericist would assume that while common knowledge is important for describing how a collective agent functions, the underlying knowledge component of that common knowledge, the justification for believing P, is still defined by the global concept.
Correct. The GE theorist assumes that the global concepts are the ones that offer the most fundamental, the most explanatory insight into the nature of knowledge itself. The local concepts just describe how that global concept manifests within specific structural constraints.
And what's the big payoff for taking on this massive, difficult task? What does GE promise us?
The explanatory prediction is simply superior explanatory power. Generic theories promise to unify vastly different phenomena. The justified belief of a solitary genius, the rationality of a massive multinational corporation, the effectiveness of an advanced AI.
And reveal conceptual patterns that traditional domain-specific theories would just miss entirely.
Exactly. If GE succeeds, it will reveal a single, elegant theory of knowledge that holds true for every single epistemic agent in the universe. That is the standard of fruitfulness by which the whole GE approach must ultimately be measured.
That is a tremendous ambition. Now that we have these two guiding principles, conceptual unity and methodological non-primacy, we can use them as a kind of diagnostic tool.
Right, to map the current state of collective epistemology.
And this matrix is fantastic because it shows that nearly every existing approach implicitly rejects at least one of these principles, which really validates the need for GE, which is category 4.
It shows that GE is filling a conceptual space that's been largely unexplored.
So let's just quickly review the non-generic categories before we dive deep into them. Category 1 is pluralism. It rejects unity, but accepts non-primacy.
That's unity plus non-primacy.
Category 2 is extrapolationism. It accepts unity, but rejects non-primacy.
So plus unity, non-primacy.
And category 3 is parasitism, which rejects both.
Unity, non-primacy.
Okay, let's start with pluralism, category 1. If they're rejecting unity, they're arguing that collective knowledge and individual knowledge are genuinely distinct kinds of things.
Yes. For the pluralist, there are at least two, maybe more, separate, genuine, and relatively independent epistemological domains of inquiry. They're just really skeptical that a single concept of knowledge can span the chasm between a mind with phenomenal consciousness and a group structure that's governed by bylaws.
What's a good example of this in action?
Well, consider models of what's called joint commitment. Philosophers like Margaret Gilbert, for instance, argue that a group's belief that P is based on the members committing to holding P as the group's official policy, regardless of what their own individual private beliefs might be.
No, so when the college union believes the industrial action is going to plan.
That belief is a sui generis, a unique kind of collective commitment. It's not just the sum of what the members think.
And why does that reject unity?
Because the concept of collective belief here relies entirely on this mechanism of joint commitment, which is a feature that's exclusive to collectives. It's intrinsically group-focused. It can't be reduced to or unified with individual belief, which relies on things like internal mental states, cognitive processing, and phenomenal feelings.
So Gilbert and others have explicitly argued against trying to measure group belief against the yardstick of individual belief.
They have. They essentially said, look, groups are not individuals, and their cognitive concepts must be designed specifically for their context. They managed to achieve methodological non-primacy. They develop concepts appropriate to the group without subordinating them to the individual, but they do it by denying conceptual unity.
So the trade-off is explanatory scope.
It is. While they do a great job of protecting the integrity of group belief, they lose the ability to analyze knowledge as a single, unified phenomenon that holds across the entire universe of agents. They create silos.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's move to extrapolationism, category 2. This category accepts conceptual unity. They believe there is one concept of knowledge, but they reject non-primacy.
So they're asserting that one domain is methodologically primary.
And this is probably the most common approach, right?
It is, and I think it's because of historical inertia and just philosophical convenience. It's simply easier to start with the domain we think we understand best, the individual, and then try to apply those standards somewhere else. The slogan here is, there is one unified domain, but we have a preferred foundational starting point.
So we start with the individual, and we basically force the collective to measure up to that standard. Can you give us an example of this individual-first extrapolation?
Sure. Think of classic reliabilism. Alvin Goldman is a key figure here.
Yeah.
So individual reliabilism says a belief is justified if and only if it's produced by a reliable cognitive process. An individual-first extrapolationist says, okay, that's our rule. So groups also have a justified belief, P, only if P is produced by a reliable cognitive process. They just borrow the concept of reliability wholesale and try to apply it to group decision-making procedures like voting rolls or consultation mechanisms.
So they maintain unity. They assert that reliability is the unified concept of justification, but they violate non-primacy because they assume the best way to develop and test that concept is through individual cases first, and then apply it outwards.
Exactly. And this leads to all sorts of problems because groups lack a lot of individual-specific traits. This is where you often see eliminativists emerge.
Okay.
There are a subtype of extrapolationists who start individual first, and then they conclude that collectives lack the necessary properties to have genuine cognitive states at all.
Like the argument we saw mentioned earlier from Cohen, claiming that groups can't have the mental feelings that are required for a genuine belief.
Yes, that's a perfect example. The individualist starts with the premise that belief requires internal qualia or some kind of phenomenal experience. Since groups lack these, the individualist concludes groups cannot genuinely believe anything.
They've asserted the primacy of the individual method, and the collective domain simply fails to meet the criterion that was derived from that primary domain.
It fails the test.
What about the reverse? Is there such a thing as collective-first extrapolation?
There is. It's less common in mainstream analytic epistemology, but it's very powerful in areas like the philosophy of science. You can think of radically social approaches, like some interpretations of Helen Longino's work on contextual empiricism. These views sometimes argue that knowledge acquisition is fundamentally a community process.
How so?
It's mediated by diverse perspectives, criticism, social interactions, so the community becomes the foundational epistemic agent.
So they assert that the methodological starting point should be the community, which makes individual knowledge derivative of that.
Exactly. An individual only counts as knowing something if their belief has been successfully integrated into or validated by the community's standard process. So they maintain unity, there's one concept of knowledge, but they violate non-primacy by asserting that the collective domain is the methodological default.
Fascinating. Okay, finally, let's look at parasitism, category 3, which rejects both conceptual unity and methodological non-primacy. This sounds like the least generous view of collective knowledge.
It is, by far. Parasitism argues that collective states are genuine, but they are entirely derivative. They are completely dependent on the individual states, making them conceptually and methodologically secondary. The classic example here is summative theories.
Which is just like simply summing up the knowledge of the members.
Right. Philosophers like Anthony Quinton have argued that when you ascribe knowledge to a group G, you are simply aggregating or summing the knowledge or the justified beliefs of its members. So the statement, "the bank knows the account details," is really just shorthand for some key subset of bank employees know the account details.
Okay, so how does that violate our two principles?
Well, it obviously violates non-primacy by being methodologically derivative. It takes its standards directly from the individual domain. But crucially, it also violates unity.
Oh.
Because the justification conferring property for the group, let's call it P star, the property of being held by a sufficient subset of members, that property must necessarily embed the property for the individual, which we'll call P.
I see. So P star is conceptually distinct from P because P star is defined by the existence of multiple Ps.
Precisely. P star is warranted by aggregation, while P is warranted by internal processes. The group property is structurally dependent on and distinct from the individual property. Therefore, the concepts are not unified, they are conceptually parasitic.
And this approach really minimizes the potential for group structures to generate emergent, non-summative knowledge.
It completely misses that, which is the main goal of robust collective epistemology in the first place.
This matrix is so essential. It makes the generic epistemology proposal, the one that accepts both unity and non-primacy, appear as this clean, powerful, and unexplored methodological necessity, rather than just another theory on the pile.
It really does. It forces us to ask why we tolerate all these non-generic approaches if the method of cases itself already seems to imply a kind of universality.
So what's the answer?
The answer, historically, has been that it is just too difficult to conceive of a theory of knowledge that relies on absolutely none of our human-centric assumptions. And that difficulty is the challenge that GE is finally embracing.
Okay, so as soon as the genericist extends the domain and rejects that human-centric primacy, they open themselves up to massive pushback.
Of course.
So let's tackle the key philosophical objections. The first one, and maybe the most intuitive, is the non-generality of epistemic concepts. You could call it the local success worry.
Right. This worry basically says, look, what if a theory that relies on features that are exclusive to individuals, like phenomenal experience or the voluntary nature of belief, what if that theory is just undeniably the best, most coherent theory for that specific local domain?
For example, let's take a theory called phenomenal conservatism.
Okay.
This theory claims that if something perceptually appears to you to be true, for example, the wall looks red to me, then you are, at least prima facie, justified in believing it is true.
It's a very intuitive and powerful theory.
And it's incredibly successful at explaining basic human perception and knowledge acquisition. But a collective, a group, cannot have something perceptually appear to it. So if this theory is so locally successful, doesn't that prove that knowledge is not kind-blind?
It's a very powerful challenge, and you could say the same thing on the other side. If those joint commitment views of group belief are undeniably the most accurate way to model the attitudes of human corporate agents, why should the genericist abandon that accuracy just for the sake of some abstract unity?
The genericist defense here can't be to just refute every single successful local theory. That would be an impossible task.
It would. It's a methodological defense, not a direct refutation. The genericist argues that we should be suspicious of the purported local success of these theories if they rely on pre-theoretical commitments that have been cultivated by studying only one domain in isolation.
So it's a form of methodological suspicion.
It is. The reason phenomenal appearance seems so central to knowledge might simply be an artifact of the fact that we've only been studying agents who possess phenomenal appearance.
It forces us to ask, is this feature, like an internal feeling or voluntary assent, is it truly necessary for justification in general, or is it just the most conveniently available feature for us to study in human minds?
That's the question. The genericist argues that we should aim for a theory, say, a robust form of evidentialism or maybe a functional reliabilism that works equally well across all agents. If the resulting generic theory has greater explanatory power, if it can unify the justification of the human mind, the corporate entity, and the AI, then its holistic success outweighs the local success of the non-generic rival.
So the genericist isn't saying phenomenal conservatism is wrong, necessarily. They're saying it's fundamentally descriptive of a local phenomenon, and a true theory of knowledge simpliciter must identify the deep shared functional features that underpin it.
Exactly. The success of generic epistemology has to be measured holistically. We accept the challenge that we must construct a single theory so powerful and so conceptually elegant that the theoretical cost of maintaining all these separate local disjunctive theories just becomes unjustifiable.
Okay, let's move to the second major objection, which directly tackles that expansion of the domain. This is demarcating epistemic agency, or what you might call the metaphor problem.
Right.
If GE treats all potential agents equally at the start, how in the world do we distinguish genuine cognitive states from mere metaphorical ascriptions?
This is the worry about intellectual inflation, right? We say things all the time like, the economy knows when to slow down, or my thermostat believes the room is too cold. If GE includes everything, are we just elevating simple metaphors to the level of philosophy?
It really seems like GE makes the already difficult boundary problem that's faced by collective epistemologists, deciding which structured groups count, even larger. Now we have to decide if a beehive or a smart washing machine counts.
The genericist readily admits that this is a serious challenge, but they argue that the tools for managing this problem are already available and are, in fact, strengthened by the GE framework. The key is that demarcation is not a starting point. It's an outcome of the reflective equilibrium process.
How does that work in practice, then?
We can use existing philosophical interpretationist resources. For instance, you could draw on Dan Dennett's intentional stance. That suggests we should ascribe beliefs and desires, cognitive states, only if doing so gives us predictive power and explanatory leverage that we wouldn't have otherwise.
Okay, so if saying, my car knows the tire pressure is low, is really just a kind of shorthand for describing the mechanical operation of its sensor array,
then the ascription is metaphorical, and it doesn't warrant a serious epistemic analysis. It doesn't add anything.
But if, on the other hand, we look at a complex structured organization and ascribing a genuine belief or justification to the corporate entity allows us to predict its future decisions in a way that just summing up the individual member beliefs does not,
then the ascription is warranted, and it should be taken seriously as a case judgment within the GE framework.
And for groups specifically, we already have robust tools for classification.
Yes, tools like the distinction that Christian List uses between different types of collective attitudes can help us refine our input. We can distinguish between aggregate attitudes, which is just simple summation,
Right.
common attitudes, which are mutually known attitudes, and corporate attitudes, which are those that genuinely belong to the collective as an agent, often tied to its constitution or its formal structure.
So the genericist process is iterative. You start broadly, you collect all the case judgments, both the literal and the metaphorical ones. Then you apply the unified theoretical principles, and then you use the resulting theoretical structure, which identifies the functional requirements for knowledge, to discard the metaphorical cases that fail to meet those functional requirements.
Exactly. The ability to distinguish between proper and improper agency becomes a kind of trained capacity, one that's developed through the reflective process itself. We don't start by deciding that only humans count. We end by identifying the irreducible functional criteria for warranting the non-metaphorical claim that an entity knows something.
And this ensures the resulting theory is truly kind-blind.
It has to be.
It really sounds like generic epistemology is offering us a roadmap to a purely functional definition of knowledge, one that's completely divorced from biology or consciousness or human political organization.
That is the core implication. It forces us to ask what the necessary structural and functional properties are for success in truth tracking, independent of the hardware or the wetware involved.
This deep dive into generic epistemology has really been a journey through the methodology of philosophy itself. We started by just noticing this simple linguistic fact that we ascribe knowledge to both individuals and powerful collectives.
And we ended up proposing a unified methodological framework to analyze this entire phenomenon.
We established that GE results from taking the standard philosophical practice, the method of cases, and just generalizing it to this extended domain of all potential epistemic agents.
And we saw that this generalization requires two massive non-negotiable commitments: conceptual unity, demanding that knowledge be a single kind across all agents, and methodological non-primacy, insisting that we weigh case judgments without any prejudice toward the agent's type.
And we saw how this stance challenges the vast majority of current collective epistemology, which so often falls into the traps of pluralism or extrapolationism or parasitism, each one sacrificing either the unity of concepts or the equality of methodological starting points.
Generic epistemology is not merely some theoretical exercise, it's an intellectual commitment. It demands that we analyze knowledge as a universal, kind-blind, functional property. It compels us to move beyond our anthropocentric limitations and seek the fundamental logic of justification wherever it might occur.
And that universality, that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. If the generic epistemologist succeeds, knowledge will be defined purely functionally. So if knowledge is truly kind-blind, if it is a property independent of any specific agent type, what irreducible functional features must any entity possess for us to warrant the literal, non-metaphorical claim that it knows something? And that entity could be an individual mind operating in silence, a global collective debating policy, or even a hypothetical advanced AI processing trillions of data points.
This challenge forces us to identify the bare minimum functional architecture required for rational success. If we can't ground knowledge in consciousness or in human social structure, we have to ground it in something else, in interpretation, in predictive power, and in the ability to reliably track the truth. That is the fundamental open question that generic epistemology puts on the table, demanding a truly universal theory of mind-independent knowledge.